The afternoon clouds hung heavy over Riverside High School, threatening rain that never quite materialized as Maya Chen pushed through the heavy double doors for the first time. She was 17, with straight dark hair that she wore long enough to hide behind when necessary, and at barely 5'3", she had perfected the art of making herself small in crowded spaces. The oversized grey sweatshirt and faded jeans she wore seemed designed to help her blend into the background, to become just another unremarkable face in a sea of students. The administrative office smelled of old paper and burnt coffee, and the woman behind the desk barely glanced up as she slid a packet of forms across the counter. Maya took them with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the locker assignment and class schedule that would define her next several months at this massive school. Coming from a small private school in Seattle, the sheer size of Riverside was overwhelming. Nearly 3,000 students moved through these halls, each one part of some intricate social hierarchy that Maya had no hope of understanding on her first day. The secretary's disinterested tone made it clear that new students were nothing special here, just another administrative task to be checked off a list. Maya nodded her thanks, her voice barely audible above the hum of the ancient heating system that rattled through the vents, as her fingers unconsciously touched the small jade pendant hidden beneath her shirt. A gift from her grandmother before she passed, Maya felt the familiar weight of anxiety settling in her chest. This was supposed to be a fresh start, an opportunity for her family after her mother's promotion brought them to this mid-sized Oregon town. But walking into the crowded hallway, Maya felt anything but hopeful. The corridor erupted with noise as the passing period began, and Maya found herself swept up in a current of bodies moving with purpose toward destinations she didn't understand. Lockers slammed with metallic crashes, conversations overlapped into an incomprehensible roar, and the squeak of sneakers on polished floors created a rhythm that spoke of teenage energy barely contained within institutional walls. She clutched her schedule like a lifeline, searching for locker 312, which according to the small map on the back of her papers should be in the west wing near the science labs. When she finally located it, wedged between a locker decorated with soccer stickers and another that bore the scars of what looked like an attempted break-in, Maya felt a small sense of relief. At least she'd found one thing in this maze of a school. She fumbled with the combination lock, her hands shaking slightly from nerves and the residual anxiety that always accompanied new situations. She'd been working with the combination for nearly a minute when she became aware of voices approaching from behind, voices that carried the confidence of people who owned this space and everyone in it. The first voice cut through the hallway noise like a blade. At 6'1", Caleb Martinez moved through Riverside High like a prince touring his kingdom, and in many ways, that's exactly what he was. His father owned the largest construction company in the county, and his mother sat on the school board, which meant that Caleb had grown up believing that rules were more like suggestions that didn't really apply to him. His dark hair was styled with the kind of casual perfection that required significant effort, and his athletic build came from years of football practice and weight training that his parents funded without question. Walking beside Caleb was his constant shadow, Marcus Webb, a stocky boy with a buzz cut and the aggressive energy of someone compensating for deep insecurity. Marcus's home life was complicated in ways that most of his classmates didn't know about, with a mother who worked double shifts and an older brother currently serving time for assault. Aligning himself with someone like Caleb gave Marcus a sense of protection and importance that he couldn't find anywhere else, even if it meant participating in behavior that some part of him knew was wrong. The third member of their group was Ethan Park, tall and lean, with the kind of quiet presence that suggested he was smarter than he pretended to be. Ethan had moved to Oregon from Los Angeles when he was 9, and he'd learned early that the easiest way to survive was to become part of the in-crowd rather than risk becoming a target himself. The irony that he was now about to help bully another Asian student wasn't lost on him. But survival instincts were powerful motivators in the complex ecosystem of high school social dynamics. Maya sensed them before she saw them, the way an animal might sense predators approaching through the underbrush. Her grandmother had taught her to trust those instincts, to always be aware of her surroundings, but Maya forced herself to continue working on her locker combination, hoping desperately that they would simply walk past her and find some other target for their attention. The lock finally clicked open on her third attempt, and she began transferring textbooks from her backpack to the narrow metal shelf, moving as quietly and unobtrusively as possible. The shadow that fell across her locker came with the overwhelming scent of expensive cologne, and Maya knew her hope of being overlooked had been futile. She turned slowly, pressing her back against the cold metal, and found herself looking up at three faces that wore expressions ranging from cruel to indifferent amusement to calculating interest. Caleb's hazel eyes held the kind of casual arrogance that came from never experiencing real consequences, while Marcus's grin revealed slightly crooked teeth and an eagerness that made Maya's stomach turn. Ethan stood slightly behind them, his face carefully neutral, but his body language suggesting he was ready to follow whatever lead the others. The confrontation that followed was depressingly familiar to Maya, who had dealt with bullies at her previous school despite her best efforts to remain invisible. They took her chemistry textbook and played keep away, tossing it between themselves while making suggestions that grew increasingly inappropriate. A crowd began to gather, students who slowed their pace or stopped altogether to watch the entertainment, some looking uncomfortable but none willing to risk becoming targets themselves by intervening. Maya recognized the dynamic immediately, the way bullies fed off each other's energy and the presence of an audience, escalating their behavior to maintain their social position and assert dominance over someone they perceived as weak. She tried asking politely for her book back, her voice soft and non-threatening, but that only seemed to encourage them. Caleb held it high above her head, just out of reach, suggesting she should beg for it on her knees. The sexual undertone of the comment sent ripples of nervous laughter through their audience, and Maya felt her face burning with embarrassment. This was how it always started, she knew. Small humiliations that tested boundaries, and if no one intervened, they would escalate until something broke, either the victim or the bully's interest. What Caleb and his friends didn't know, what no one at Riverside High could have known, was that Maya's quiet exterior and small stature concealed years of intensive training. Her grandmother had been a master of Wing Chun, a Chinese martial art that emphasized efficiency and directness over brute strength, and she had begun teaching Maya when she was barely old enough to walk. The training had been presented as a way to honor their family heritage and maintain a connection to their cultural roots. But her grandmother had also been very clear about its practical applications in a world that wasn't always kind to small, quiet girls who seemed like easy targets. The lessons had been rigorous and demanding, requiring discipline that most children Maya's age couldn't sustain. Her grandmother had taught her that martial arts wasn't about aggression or seeking conflict, but about developing the skill and confidence to protect yourself and others when all other options had been exhausted. She'd emphasized again and again that true strength lay not in the ability to hurt others, but in the wisdom to know when fighting was necessary and when it was not. The training included not just physical techniques, but also lessons in awareness, de-escalation, and the psychology of conflict. creating a comprehensive understanding of self-defense that went far beyond simply learning how to throw a punch. Maya had hoped she would never need to use those skills, but as Caleb's hand shot out to push her shoulder hard enough to make her stumble backward, she felt something shift inside her. This was the boundary her grandmother had warned her about. The line between tolerating harassment and allowing herself to become a victim. The push wasn't just aggressive, it was a clear escalation that signaled Caleb's willingness to employ physical violence to maintain his dominance and entertain his followers. What happened next occurred so quickly that many of the onlookers would later struggle to explain exactly what they'd seen. As Caleb reached out to push her again, Maya's hand moved with practiced precision, redirecting his force and using his own momentum against him. The Wing Chun principle of borrowed force meant that she didn't need to match his strength. She simply needed to guide it where she wanted it to go. Caleb found himself stumbling forward, off balance, his expression shifting from arrogant amusement to confused surprise in the space of a heartbeat. Marcus moved in immediately, his fists already clenched, ready to back up his friend and restore the natural order where people like them dominated people like Maya without consequence. But Maya had been trained extensively in dealing with multiple opponents, and her grandmother's lessons had emphasized the importance of staying calm and focused even when facing overwhelming odds. As Marcus swung at her with a wild haymaker that telegraphed his intention long before his fist arrived, Maya stepped inside his guard with the kind of footwork that looked almost like dancing, deflecting his arm and using his own force to send him crashing into the lockers with a metallic bang that echoed through the suddenly silent hallway. The crowd that had gathered to watch what they assumed would be typical bullying entertainment found themselves witnessing something entirely different. Ethan, perhaps more intelligent than his companions, took a step back rather than engaging, his hands raised in a gesture that suggested he wanted no part of whatever was happening. Caleb, recovering from his initial shock, came at Maya with more serious intent. But years of sparring against opponents larger and stronger than herself had prepared her for exactly this situation. She moved with economy and efficiency, never using more force than necessary, always redirecting rather than blocking, turning his aggression into his own defeat with techniques that looked almost effortless to the untrained eye. Within 30 seconds, both Caleb and Marcus were on the ground, breathing hard, their confidence shattered along with their assumption that Maya was just another easy target. She stood over them, not in an aggressive stance, but in one of calm readiness, her breathing controlled, and even despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The chemistry textbook that had started the whole confrontation lay on the floor between them, forgotten in the aftermath of their humiliation. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the harsh breathing of the two boys on the floor and the shuffling of feet as students shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to process what they'd just witnessed. Maya picked up her textbook and turned back to her locker, her hands steady now despite the trembling that threatened to overtake her now that the immediate threat had passed. She had defended herself, but she'd also just painted a massive target on her back, and she knew from experience that this confrontation was just the beginning of something much more complicated. The bell rang, signaling the end of passing period, and the crowd dispersed with unusual speed, students eager to spread the news of what they'd witnessed to every corner of the school. By the time Maya made it to her first class, chemistry with Mrs. Patterson, whispers had already begun circulating about the new girl who had taken down Caleb Martinez and Marcus Webb without breaking a sweat. Some versions of the story were relatively accurate, while others had already begun adding embellishments that transformed the brief confrontation into something resembling a martial arts movie scene. Maya slid into a seat near the back of the classroom, hoping to regain some sense of invisibility, but she could feel eyes on her throughout the period. Some looked at her with newfound respect, others with curiosity or wariness, and a few with the kind of calculation that suggested they were already trying to figure out how to use this new information to their own advantage. The social dynamics of Riverside High had been disrupted, and Maya understood that she had inadvertently positioned herself at the center of something she hadn't wanted and didn't fully understand. At lunch, she found a table in the corner of the cafeteria, as far from the center of activity as possible, and tried to focus on the sandwich her mother had packed that morning. The cafeteria was its own universe of established territories and unspoken rules, with each table representing a different social group or subculture. The athletes dominated the center tables, the theater kids clustered near the windows, the academics occupied the quieter corners, and dozens of other micro-communities filled the spaces between. Maya had hoped to observe from the periphery, to learn the landscape before attempting to navigate it, but her confrontation with Caleb had already made that impossible. She was halfway through her sandwich when a girl with bright purple highlights and multiple ear piercings sat down across from her without asking. The girl's name was Jordan Price, and she had the kind of confident energy that suggested she didn't care much about the opinions of the popular crowd. Jordan was an artist, her fingers perpetually stained with paint and charcoal, and she moved through Riverside High with an independence that Maya found both impressive and slightly intimidating. Jordan introduced herself with a directness that Maya appreciated, explaining that she'd witnessed the hallway confrontation and wanted to know where Maya had learned to fight like that. The question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, and Maya found herself relaxing slightly as she gave a carefully edited version of her training history. She mentioned her grandmother's background in martial arts and the family tradition of passing down these skills, but she was careful not to reveal too much about the extent of her training or her grandmother's philosophy about when and how to use those skills. Their conversation attracted the attention of several other students who existed on the margins of Riverside High's social hierarchy. There was Alex Morrison, a quiet boy who spent most of his time in the library and wore t-shirts featuring obscure science fiction references. Sarah Kim, a sophomore who played violin in the school orchestra and had transferred to Riverside after being bullied mercilessly at her previous school. David Torres, a senior who worked 2 part-time jobs to help support his family and had little patience for the casual cruelty that often passed for normal behavior among his peers. These students, and several others who drifted over to Maya's table during that first lunch period, represented what Jordan jokingly called the island of misfit toys, students who for various reasons didn't fit neatly into Riverside High's established social categories. They weren't quite outcasts, but they weren't part of the popular crowd either, existing instead in a kind of social neutral zone where they were generally left alone as long as they didn't draw too much attention to themselves. Maya's confrontation with Caleb had definitely drawn attention, but it had also sparked something else, a sense that maybe someone had finally stood up to the bullies who made life miserable for so many students. Over the following weeks, Maya discovered that her life at Riverside High was going to be far more complicated than she had anticipated. Caleb and Marcus hadn't forgotten their humiliation, and while they didn't directly confront her again, they made their presence known through a campaign of subtle harassment that was difficult to prove but constant in its pressure. Her locker was vandalized multiple times, covered with crude drawings and hateful messages that janitors would clean off only to have them reappear the next day. Items would disappear from her backpack between classes, important assignments and textbooks that would turn up in trash cans or hidden in random locations around the school. The harassment extended to social media, where anonymous accounts began posting distorted versions of the hallway incident, accompanied by racist and sexist comments that made Maya's stomach turn. Screenshots circulated through group chats, each retelling adding new layers of fabrication until the original event was barely recognizable beneath the embellishments. Some posts accused her of being dangerous and unstable, a violent person who had attacked innocent students without provocation. Others used racial slurs and made references to martial arts stereotypes that revealed the underlying prejudices that many students held but rarely expressed openly. Maya reported the incidents to school administrators, but found herself facing a bureaucracy that was more interested in maintaining order than addressing the underlying problems. The assistant principal, Mr. Henderson, a tired-looking man in his 40s who seemed overwhelmed by the daily demands of managing 3,000 teenagers, took her reports but did little to follow up on them. Without concrete proof of who was responsible for the vandalism and online harassment, and with Caleb's family's influence in the community making administrators reluctant to take strong action against him, Maya found herself stuck in a frustrating limbo where she was simultaneously the victim and somehow also the problem. Her grandmother's teachings about patience and strategic thinking became more relevant than ever during these weeks. Maya understood that responding to each incident with physical confrontation would only play into her tormentors' hands, giving them ammunition to paint her as the aggressor and justify escalating their own actions. Instead, she focused on documenting everything, taking photographs of her vandalized locker, saving screenshots of harassing messages, and keeping a detailed written log of every incident with dates, times, and witnesses when possible. It was tedious work that felt inadequate in the face of daily harassment, but her grandmother had taught her that battles were often won through preparation and patience rather than immediate action. At the same time, something unexpected was happening within the broader student body at Riverside High. Maya's confrontation with Caleb had created ripples that extended far beyond her immediate situation. Students who had been victimized by the same group of bullies began to feel like maybe they didn't have to simply accept their treatment as inevitable. The whispered conversations in hallways and classrooms began to shift from gossip about the fight itself to larger discussions about the culture of bullying that pervaded the school and the administrator's apparent unwillingness or inability to address it effectively. Jordan Price became something of an informal organizer, using her connections across different social groups to facilitate conversations about what could be done to address the problem. She was careful to keep Maya at arm's length from these discussions initially, understanding that Maya's involvement would paint everything with a negative brush, given how Caleb and his friends were working to control the narrative about the hallway incident. But Jordan had been at Riverside High since freshman year, and she had accumulated her own collection of stories about students who'd been bullied, harassed, or worse, by the same group that was now targeting Maya. The tipping point came about 6 weeks into the school year, during an incident in the cafeteria that would become a defining moment in Riverside High's history. Maya had been sitting with her usual group of friends when Caleb, Marcus, and several other members of the football team surrounded their table. The cafeteria had been crowded as usual, with lunch monitors on duty and hundreds of students present, but that didn't stop Caleb from escalating his harassment campaign in a very public way. He started with verbal taunts, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, but calculated to seem like just friendly banter if an administrator happened to overhear. The comments were laced with racist and sexist undertones, suggesting that Maya should go back to wherever she came from and questioning whether she was even in the country legally, despite the fact that her family had been in America for 3 generations. When Maya ignored him, continuing her conversation with Jordan and Alex as if Caleb didn't exist, his frustration became visible in the tightening of his jaw and the flush that crept up his neck. Marcus, always eager to escalate situations when Caleb seemed frustrated, reached out and knocked Maya's lunch tray off the table, sending her sandwich, apple and bottle of water crashing to the floor with enough force to draw attention from across the cafeteria. The subsequent silence was immediate and profound, with hundreds of students turning to watch what would happen next. This was the moment that everyone had been anticipating since the hallway confrontation, the inevitable second round that would determine the true hierarchy and establish once and for all whether Maya's initial victory had been a fluke or something more significant. Maya stood up slowly, her body language calm and controlled despite the adrenaline she could feel surging through her system. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that the strongest warriors were those who chose their battles carefully and understood that sometimes the greatest victories were achieved without throwing a single punch. She looked directly at Caleb, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze that didn't challenge but didn't back down either, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly in the silent cafeteria. She asked him a simple question about why he felt the need to do this, whether knocking over someone's lunch made him feel powerful or whether it was something else, some deeper insecurity or pain that he was trying to cover up by hurting others. The question caught Caleb off guard because it didn't follow the expected script, where he would escalate until she either backed down or fought back, allowing him to either reassert his dominance or play the victim of her aggression. Instead, she had turned the confrontation into something else entirely, a public examination of his motivations and behavior that put him in an uncomfortable spotlight. Marcus moved to intervene, his fists already clenched, but Maya shifted her stance in a way that made it clear she was ready to defend herself if necessary, while simultaneously making no aggressive moves toward them. The subtle shift in her posture communicated volumes to anyone who understood body language, and several of the athletes at nearby tables who had martial arts training themselves recognized what they were seeing. This wasn't someone who was afraid or uncertain. This was someone who was absolutely confident in their ability to handle whatever came next, but who was choosing not to fight unless absolutely necessary. What happened next surprised everyone in the cafeteria, including Maya herself. A sophomore named James Wilson, who had been bullied by Caleb's group the previous year, badly enough that he'd missed 2 weeks of school due to anxiety, stood up from his table and walked over to stand next to Maya. He didn't say anything, didn't make any threatening gestures, but his presence next to her created a statement of solidarity that shifted the dynamics of the confrontation entirely. Within seconds, other students began standing as well. Sarah Kim, the violin player, moved to join them. Alex Morrison closed his laptop and stood. David Torres left his partially eaten lunch and crossed the cafeteria. More students followed, some who had been direct victims of bullying, others who had simply witnessed too much cruelty and were tired of feeling helpless. Within 2 minutes, more than 50 students were standing in silent solidarity with Maya, creating a human barrier between her and Caleb's group that communicated a message more powerful than any words could have expressed. The cafeteria monitors finally intervened, breaking up the confrontation and sending students back to their seats, but the damage to Caleb's social position had been done. The incident sparked a series of conversations that extended beyond the student body to parents, teachers, and administrators who could no longer ignore the extent of the bullying problem at Riverside High. Jordan Price and several other students organized a petition demanding that the school implement more effective anti-bullying policies and create consequences for students who engaged in harassment regardless of their family's influence in the community. The petition gathered more than 2,000 signatures in just 3 days, and the local newspaper picked up the story after several parents reached out to reporters about their children's experiences with bullying at Riverside. The coverage painted the school administration in an unflattering light, highlighting their failure to address a problem that had been festering for years and the ways in which certain students seemed to operate with impunity due to their families' connections and resources. Principal Ramsey, a woman in her late 50s who had been running Riverside High for more than a decade, found herself under pressure from the school board to implement meaningful changes. The public attention on the issue made it impossible to continue with business as usual, and she convened a series of meetings with students, teachers, and community members to discuss how to address the school's culture of bullying and harassment. Maya was asked to participate in these meetings, though she was careful to position herself not as the hero of the story, but simply as one voice among many who had been affected by the problem. The reforms that emerged from these conversations were comprehensive and represented a significant shift in how Riverside High approached student behavior and discipline. A new anti-bullying policy was implemented that included clear definitions of harassment, explicit consequences for violations that would be enforced regardless of a student's social position or family connections, and protections for students who reported incidents. A peer mediation program was established, training students in conflict resolution techniques and creating alternatives to punitive discipline for situations where restorative justice might be more appropriate. Additional counseling resources were allocated for students struggling with the social pressures of high school, recognizing that many bullies were themselves dealing with trauma or mental health issues that manifested as aggression toward others. For Caleb Martinez, the aftermath of the cafeteria incident was a profound reckoning. He was suspended for 2 weeks and required to complete 20 hours of community service and attend mandatory counseling sessions before he could return to classes. His father's attempts to use his influence to minimize the consequences backfired when the school board, under pressure from public attention and the threat of legal action from several families, made it clear that no student would be exempt from the new policies regardless of their family connections. The suspension meant missing 2 football games, which cost him his starting position, and the public nature of the incident damaged his social standing in ways that would take months to recover from. More significantly, the mandatory counseling sessions forced Caleb to confront aspects of himself and his behavior that he'd been avoiding for years. His counselor, Dr. Margaret Foster, was an experienced therapist who specialized in working with adolescents and had no patience for the kind of surface-level engagement that Caleb initially attempted. She pushed him to explore the roots of his need to dominate others, the ways in which his family's expectations and his own insecurities had shaped his behavior, and the impact his actions had on his victims. The process was uncomfortable and often painful, forcing Caleb to see himself as something other than the hero of his own story. Marcus Webb's journey was different, but no less transformative. The cafeteria incident served as a wake-up call that his association with Caleb was leading him down a path that would ultimately destroy his future. His mother, already struggling to keep their family afloat financially and dealing with the aftermath of his brother's incarceration, made it clear that she couldn't handle another son going down the wrong path. Marcus began attending an anger management group at a local community center, where he met other teenagers dealing with similar issues of aggression and poor impulse control. Through these sessions, he began to understand that his behavior toward others was a manifestation of his own feelings of powerlessness and his need to prove his worth through dominance rather than achievement. Ethan Park, who had largely avoided the worst consequences of the cafeteria incident by not actively participating in the harassment, still found himself grappling with guilt over his passive complicity in the bullying. He'd stood by while others were victimized, telling himself that his silence was simply survival strategy, but the collective action of 50 students standing up for Maya forced him to reconsider whether survival was worth the cost of his integrity. He began volunteering as a peer mentor for incoming freshmen, using his knowledge of Riverside High's social dynamics to help new students navigate the school's complex landscape and avoid becoming either victims or perpetrators of bullying. For Maya, the months following the cafeteria incident brought unexpected visibility and responsibility. She became something of a reluctant symbol for standing up to bullying, which brought with it both positive attention and additional pressure. Students she'd never met would approach her in hallways to share their own stories of being bullied or to thank her for what she'd done. Local news outlets wanted to interview her, positioning her as a hero in a narrative about youth activism and standing up to injustice. But Maya was uncomfortable with that framing, knowing that the situation was far more complex than any simple story of good triumphing over evil. She declined most media requests, understanding that her grandmother's teachings about the warrior's path emphasized humility and restraint rather than seeking glory or recognition. The few interviews she did agree to were carefully focused on the collective action of students rather than her individual role, emphasizing that meaningful change required community effort rather than individual heroism. She stressed the importance of creating systems and structures that prevented bullying rather than relying on victims to defend themselves. And she was clear about the fact that not everyone had the training or ability to physically defend themselves the way she had. Jordan Price emerged as the true organizer and leader of the broader anti-bullying movement at Riverside High, using her artistic talents to create compelling posters and social media campaigns that kept attention focused on the need for sustained change, rather than allowing the momentum to dissipate once the initial crisis passed. She worked with school administrators to design the peer mediation program, drawing on research about successful conflict resolution strategies and adapting them to Riverside High's specific context. Her apartment became an informal headquarters for student activists, with planning meetings and strategy sessions that brought together students from across the school's social spectrum. The transformation of Riverside High's culture wasn't immediate or complete. There were setbacks and resistance from students who felt that the new policies were too restrictive or that the focus on bullying was an overreaction to isolated incidents. Some parents complained that the disciplinary measures were too harsh or unfairly targeted their children. Teachers struggled with the additional responsibilities of enforcing the new policies while also managing their regular classroom duties. But slowly, over the course of the school year, something began to shift in the fundamental dynamics of how students interacted with each other. The peer mediation program proved particularly effective, providing a space for students to address conflicts before they escalated into violence or harassment. Trained student mediators helped facilitate conversations between parties in conflict, using techniques that emphasized listening, empathy, and finding mutually acceptable solutions rather than simply determining who was right and who was wrong. The program wasn't appropriate for all situations, particularly cases involving serious harassment or violence, but for many of the everyday conflicts that arose in a school of 3,000 teenagers, it provided an alternative to both fighting and administrative discipline. Maya found herself drawn into this work almost accidentally, her combination of fighting skills and philosophical approach to conflict, making her a natural fit for training other peer mediators. She worked with Dr. Foster, the counselor who had worked with Caleb, to develop curriculum that incorporated her grandmother's teachings about awareness, de-escalation, and the wise use of strength. The training emphasized that physical self-defense was always a last resort, to be used only when all other options had been exhausted and when facing imminent danger, but that the confidence that came from knowing you could defend yourself often meant you never had to. As the school year progressed, Maya's friendship group expanded beyond the initial collection of social misfits who had gravitated toward her during those first difficult weeks. She found herself connecting with students from across Riverside High's social spectrum, including some of the athletes who had initially been allies of Caleb, but who had grown uncomfortable with his behavior. These new friendships were sometimes awkward and complicated, requiring all parties to navigate histories of conflict and mistrust, but they also represented the kind of bridge building that was essential for genuine cultural change. One particularly significant relationship developed with Jackson Hart, the captain of the football team, and someone who had been friends with Caleb since elementary school. Jackson had been away at a college football camp during the cafeteria incident, and when he returned to find his team fractured and his best friend suspended, he'd initially been angry at what he perceived as an overreaction to typical teenage behavior. But as he learned more about the extent of Caleb's harassment campaign and the experiences of students who had been victimized, Jackson began to question assumptions he'd held about acceptable behavior and the responsibilities that came with his position of social influence. Jackson's decision to publicly support the new anti-bullying policies and to distance himself from Caleb's more problematic behaviors sent shockwaves through Riverside High's athletic community. As team captain, his position carried significant weight, and his willingness to call out behavior that he'd previously ignored or tacitly supported gave permission for other athletes to do the same. It also created a path for Caleb to potentially rehabilitate his reputation by demonstrating genuine change rather than simply waiting for the controversy to blow over. The relationship between Maya and Caleb remained complicated and tense throughout the school year. They moved in different social circles and generally avoided direct interaction. But the nature of high school meant that complete avoidance was impossible. They shared several classes, attended the same school events, and occasionally found themselves in situations where they had to interact civilly. Caleb's counseling was slowly helping him understand the impact of his actions and develop healthier ways of processing his emotions and relating to others. But genuine change was a slow and difficult process that involved repeatedly confronting uncomfortable truths about himself. There was a pivotal moment in late spring when Caleb approached Maya after one of their shared history classes. The hallway was relatively empty, with most students having already headed to their next period, and Maya's initial instinct was to be wary of what this conversation might bring. But Caleb's body language was different from their previous interactions, lacking the aggressive confidence that had always characterized his presence. He asked if they could talk, and Maya, after a moment of consideration, agreed to hear him out. What followed was an uncomfortable but necessary conversation about accountability and making amends. Caleb apologized for his behavior, not with the performative quality that sometimes accompanied forced apologies, but with genuine acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused and the ways in which his actions had affected Maya's experience at Riverside High. He didn't make excuses or try to justify his behavior by referencing his own difficulties or family pressures. He simply owned his choices and the consequences they'd had for others. Maya accepted the apology, but was clear that forgiveness was a process rather than a single moment. She acknowledged his apparent growth, but noted that true change would be demonstrated through sustained different behavior rather than words. It was a conversation that acknowledged the complexity of human behavior and growth, refusing to reduce either of them to simple categories of hero or villain, victim or perpetrator. They would likely never be friends, but they had taken a small step toward coexistence based on mutual respect rather than conflict. As graduation approached at the end of Maya's junior year, though she still had another year at Riverside High, the senior class that had been at the center of the year's transformation prepared to leave. Jordan Price had been accepted to an art school in San Francisco, where she planned to continue combining her artistic talents with social activism. Jackson Hart had received a football scholarship to a state university where he intended to study education with the goal of eventually becoming a coach who could influence young athletes toward positive values. Even Caleb Martinez, his reputation slowly rebuilding through genuine efforts at change, had been accepted to a small liberal arts college where he planned to study business, but with a newfound awareness of his responsibilities to others. The graduation ceremony included a special acknowledgement of the senior class's role in transforming Riverside High's culture, with Principal Ramsey noting that the changes implemented that year had already begun showing measurable results in reduced disciplinary incidents and improved student well-being metrics. She emphasized that the work was far from complete, but that the foundation had been laid for sustained positive change that would benefit future generations of Riverside students. Maya watched the ceremony from the audience, reflecting on her own complex year and the ways in which her grandmother's teachings had been tested and validated in ways she'd never anticipated. She had come to Riverside High hoping to remain invisible, to simply survive her high school years without incident, but circumstances had forced her into a very different role. She'd learned that strength came in many forms, that physical capability was only valuable when combined with wisdom about when and how to use it, and that the most meaningful victories were often those achieved through collective action rather than individual heroism. The pendant around her neck, her grandmother's tiger claw, felt heavier than usual as she contemplated the year behind her and the year still ahead. Her grandmother had passed away before seeing Maya apply her teachings in such a public way. But Maya felt confident that she would have been proud not of the fighting itself, which had been brief and restrained, but of the way Maya had navigated the complex aftermath and contributed to creating lasting, positive change, rather than simply responding to immediate threats. That summer, Maya worked as a junior counselor at a martial arts summer camp, helping teach younger students the fundamentals of Wing Chun while also incorporating lessons about conflict resolution and the ethical dimensions of knowing how to fight. She found the teaching work deeply satisfying, connecting her to her grandmother's legacy in ways that felt meaningful and purposeful. The students ranged from 6 to 14 years old, and many came to the camp with their own experiences of being bullied or feeling powerless in difficult situations. Maya emphasized to her students that martial arts training wasn't primarily about learning to hurt others, but about developing confidence, discipline, and awareness. She taught them that the goal was never to seek out conflicts, but to be prepared to protect yourself and others when absolutely necessary. She shared simplified versions of her experience at Riverside High, careful to focus on the lessons about choosing battles wisely and using minimal necessary force, rather than glamorizing the physical confrontations themselves. When she returned to Riverside High for her senior year, Maya found a school that was continuing to evolve in positive directions. The peer mediation program had expanded, with more trained mediators and increased support from the administration. The anti-bullying policies had been refined based on a year of implementation experience, addressing gaps and weaknesses that had become apparent. A new elective class on conflict resolution and social justice had been added to the curriculum, taught by Dr. Foster and incorporating materials that Maya had helped develop based on her grandmother's teachings. Maya's role in the school had shifted as well, from reluctant symbol to respected leader. She was elected as one of the senior class representatives on student government, a position she'd never sought, but which her peers insisted she take. She continued working with the peer mediation program, now training new mediators and helping facilitate some of the more complex conflicts that arose. She also served as a mentor for incoming freshmen, particularly those who seemed isolated or vulnerable, helping them navigate Riverside High's social landscape and connecting them with resources and support. Caleb Martinez returned for his final semester, having taken time off to work and complete additional counseling after his earlier suspension. His position in the school's social hierarchy had fundamentally changed, and he no longer commanded the automatic deference that his family's influence and his physical presence had once guaranteed. But he'd also developed genuine relationships based on mutual respect, rather than fear or social calculation. He continued his work in community service, now volunteering at a youth center where he worked with middle school students, trying to help them avoid the mistakes he'd made. The relationship between Maya and Caleb remained cordial but distant. They acknowledged each other in hallways, worked together occasionally on school projects when assigned to the same groups, but never developed anything resembling friendship. That was probably healthy, a recognition that some relationships were damaged beyond full repair, but that people could still coexist respectfully in shared spaces. It was a more mature understanding than most high school students achieved, reflecting the growth that both of them had experienced through their difficult year. As graduation approached for Maya's senior year, she found herself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple desire to remain invisible and had evolved into something far more complex and meaningful. She'd been accepted to Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, where she planned to study international relations with a focus on conflict resolution and peace building. The program felt like a natural extension of the work she'd done at Riverside High, scaling up the lessons about preventing violence and building communities based on mutual respect rather than domination. Her application essay had focused on her experiences at Riverside High, not emphasizing her martial arts skills or the physical confrontations, but rather exploring what she'd learned about the complex interplay between individual courage and collective action, the importance of institutional structures in preventing violence, and the ways in which even brief moments of moral courage could catalyze broader cultural transformation. The admissions committee had apparently found her perspective compelling, offering her a substantial scholarship that made attending Georgetown financially feasible for her family. The graduation ceremony for Maya's class was held on a warm June evening, with families and friends filling the football stadium to capacity. Principal Ramsey gave another speech about the importance of moral courage and standing up for what was right, explicitly referencing the changes that had begun with the previous year's senior class and had been sustained and expanded by Maya's graduating class. She noted that Riverside High had become something of a model for other schools in the region, with administrators from neighboring districts visiting to learn about their anti-bullying programs and peer mediation initiatives. Maya had been selected as one of 3 student speakers chosen by her classmates to represent their experiences and perspectives. She'd spent weeks working on her speech, wanting to honor her grandmother's memory and the lessons she'd taught, while also acknowledging the collective nature of the changes at Riverside High. When she finally stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd of graduating seniors and their families, she felt a calm focus that reminded her of the moments before sparring matches in her grandmother's training studio. Her speech began with a story about her grandmother, the woman who had taught her not just how to defend herself physically, but how to think about strength, courage, and responsibility. She spoke about arriving at Riverside High feeling afraid and uncertain, hoping only to survive without incident, and how circumstances had forced her to make difficult choices about when to fight and when to seek alternative solutions. She emphasized that her individual actions had been far less important than the collective response of students who had chosen to stand together in solidarity rather than remaining divided and vulnerable. She talked about the ways in which systems and structures could either enable or prevent bullying, and the importance of creating communities where everyone felt safe and valued, rather than relying on individuals to defend themselves against harassment. She acknowledged that changing culture was difficult and that Riverside High still had work to do, but that the progress they'd made demonstrated what was possible when people committed themselves to mutual respect and justice rather than accepting cruelty as inevitable. Her speech concluded with a challenge to her classmates to carry the lessons they'd learned at Riverside High into whatever came next in their lives. She urged them to remember that real strength lay not in the ability to dominate others, but in the wisdom to know when fighting was necessary and when other approaches would be more effective. She reminded them that the most important battles were often won through patience, strategic thinking, and collective action rather than individual heroism or physical confrontation. The standing ovation that followed her speech lasted several minutes, with many in the audience visibly moved by her words and the transformation they'd witnessed in Riverside High over the past 2 years. For Maya, it was a moment of profound satisfaction, not because of personal recognition, but because of the knowledge that she'd contributed to creating something lasting that would continue benefiting students long after she left for Georgetown. As summer arrived and her classmates dispersed to colleges and jobs across the country, Maya spent her final weeks in Oregon preparing for her move to Washington, D.C. She continued teaching at the martial arts camp, now as a senior instructor, passing on her grandmother's teachings to a new generation of students. She also worked with Dr. Foster to create training materials that could be used by other schools interested in implementing similar peer mediation and conflict resolution programs, hoping to help spread the lessons of Riverside High to broader communities. On one of her last days in Oregon, Maya visited her grandmother's grave, something she'd been doing regularly since the woman's death 3 years earlier. She told her grandmother about Georgetown, about the work she hoped to do, about the ways in which the teachings about strength and wisdom had shaped not just her own life, but the lives of countless other students at Riverside High. She thanked her for the lessons, for the discipline, for the understanding that true warriors fought not for glory, but to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As she prepared to leave the cemetery, Maya noticed a small tiger figurine that someone had left at her grandmother's headstone, a gift from one of the students at the summer camp who had heard stories about the woman who had taught Maya everything she knew about martial arts and life. The gesture reminded her that legacies extended beyond individual lives, that the lessons we learn and teach continue reverberating through time, touching people we may never meet in ways we can't fully predict. Years later, when she was working for an international NGO focused on conflict resolution and violence prevention, Maya would still sometimes think back to that autumn day when she'd first walked into Riverside High, hoping only to remain invisible and survive her high school years without incident. She'd learned that sometimes the universe had different plans, that circumstances could force us out of our comfort zones and into situations that required us to make difficult choices about who we wanted to be and what we stood for. She had proven to herself and others that it was possible to stand up to bullying without becoming a bully yourself, to use strength in service of protection rather than domination, and to create positive change through a combination of individual courage and collective action. Most importantly, she'd learned that her grandmother's teachings about the warrior's path weren't just abstract philosophy, but practical wisdom that could be applied to real-world situations, ranging from high school hallways to international conflicts. Back at Riverside High, the programs and policies that had been implemented during Maya's time there continued to evolve and improve. Successive classes of students learned about conflict resolution and peer mediation, developing skills that would serve them well beyond their high school years. The school's culture, while not perfect, had fundamentally shifted away from one that tolerated or even celebrated bullying toward one that actively worked to prevent harassment and create inclusive community. Caleb Martinez went on to complete his college degree and eventually joined his father's business, but with a very different approach to leadership than he might have brought otherwise. He focused on creating workplace cultures based on respect and collaboration rather than fear and intimidation, and he became involved in youth mentoring programs that helped troubled teenagers develop better coping mechanisms than the violence and aggression he'd once relied on. He never forgot the lessons learned during that difficult year at Riverside High, and he worked to ensure that his own children would grow up with different values than he'd initially absorbed. Marcus Webb became a social worker specializing in anger management and working with at-risk youth, drawing on his own experiences to help teenagers avoid the destructive patterns he'd fallen into. His work was deeply personal, driven by a desire to help others avoid the mistakes that had nearly derailed his own life. He maintained occasional contact with Maya through social media, congratulating her on career milestones and sharing updates about his own work, a connection that represented the possibility of growth and transformation even after serious harm had been done. Ethan Park went to medical school and eventually became a pediatrician, motivated in part by his memories of the vulnerable students he'd failed to protect during his own time at Riverside High. He kept a photo on his office desk of Maya receiving her diploma, a reminder of the courage it took to do the right thing even when the cost was high and the outcome uncertain. He used the lessons from that year to think about how to create healthcare environments where patients felt safe and respected, recognizing that power dynamics existed in medical settings just as they did in high schools. Jordan Price built a successful career as an artist and activist, creating work that explored themes of justice, community, and collective action. Her art installations often incorporated elements of the anti-bullying campaigns she'd organized at Riverside High, and she frequently spoke about the ways in which creative expression could be used as a tool for social change. She maintained close friendships with many of the students who had been part of the movement to transform Riverside High's culture, understanding that the bonds formed during that intense period were ones that would last a lifetime. And Maya herself continued working in international conflict resolution, applying the lessons her grandmother had taught her to situations far more complex and dangerous than high school hallways. She specialized in helping communities recover from violence and build sustainable peace, always emphasizing the importance of addressing root causes rather than simply responding to immediate crises. She worked in war zones and post-conflict societies, using her understanding of human behavior and conflict dynamics to help create systems and structures that prevented violence rather than merely responding to it. But no matter where her work took her or how far she traveled from Oregon, Maya never forgot the lessons of her time at Riverside High. She understood that the fundamental dynamics of human conflict remained remarkably consistent, whether you were dealing with high school bullies or international adversaries, that the same principles of awareness, de-escalation, and wise use of force applied across contexts. Most importantly, she remembered that the greatest victories were often achieved through patience, strategic thinking, and collective action, rather than individual heroism or physical confrontation. The tiger claw pendant her grandmother had given her remained around her neck throughout her travels, a constant reminder of the teachings that had shaped her understanding of strength, courage, and responsibility. It represented not just her grandmother's specific lessons about martial arts and self-defense, but a broader philosophy about how to move through the world with awareness and integrity, protecting those who needed protection while using violence only as an absolute last resort. In the end, the story of Maya's time at Riverside High became a story about more than just standing up to bullies or learning to defend yourself physically. It became a story about the ways in which individual moments of courage could catalyze broader cultural transformation, about the importance of creating systems and structures that prevented harm rather than simply responding to it, and about the possibility of growth and redemption even for those who had caused significant harm to others. It was a story that reminded people that real strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when fighting was necessary and when alternative approaches would be more effective. It demonstrated that the most powerful changes often came not from individual heroes, but from communities coming together in solidarity and demanding better from themselves and their institutions. And it proved that even the quietest person could find their voice when circumstances demanded it, that courage came in many forms, and that the choices we make in moments of crisis could reverberate through time in ways we might never fully understand. For the students who had been part of that transformation at Riverside High, the lessons they learned about moral courage, conflict resolution, and community building would continue shaping their choices and actions long after they left the familiar hallways of their school. They had learned that it was possible to break cycles of violence and intimidation, to create communities based on mutual respect rather than fear, and to use whatever abilities they possessed in service of justice and protection rather than personal gain or domination. These were lessons that would serve them well in whatever paths their lives took, whether they became teachers or doctors, artists or engineers, social workers or business leaders. They had learned that the world they wanted to see had to be built deliberately and maintained constantly. That culture change required sustained effort rather than single dramatic moments, and that everyone had a role to play in creating communities where all people felt safe and valued. And somewhere in all of this, in the complexity and messiness of human growth and social transformation, lay the truth that Maya's grandmother had tried to teach her years earlier in that training studio. The truth that real warriors fought not for glory or recognition, but to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and that the strongest people were those who had the courage to choose peace when violence would have been easier. It was a truth that transcended the specific circumstances of any one school or situation, speaking to fundamental questions about how humans should relate to each other and use whatever power and abilities they possessed. The story of Riverside High became a reminder that change was possible, that young people had the capacity to reshape the cultures and institutions they inherited, and that the choices individuals made in moments of crisis could create ripples that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. It was a story about hope and transformation, about the possibility of growth and redemption, and about the enduring power of communities coming together to demand better from themselves and each other. For Maya Chen, standing on the edge of her future and looking back at the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple desire to remain invisible, the lessons were clear. She had learned that strength came in many forms, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it, and that the most important battles were often won not through physical confrontation, but through patience, strategic thinking, and collective action. She had learned that her grandmother's teachings about the warrior's path were not just abstract philosophy, but practical wisdom that could be applied to creating the kind of world she wanted to live in. And as she prepared to carry those lessons forward into new challenges and opportunities, Maya understood that the story of her time at Riverside High wasn't really ending, but simply evolving, that the transformation she'd helped catalyze would continue rippling outward, touching lives and shaping communities in ways she might never fully know or understand. It was a humbling and empowering realization, one that reminded her of the responsibility that came with knowledge and ability, and the importance of using whatever gifts we possessed in service of something larger than ourselves. The tiger's claw against her chest felt warm in the afternoon sun as Maya closed her grandmother's journal one final time before packing it away for the move to Washington. The last page contained a quote that she'd read dozens of times, but which now seemed to carry new meaning in light of everything that had happened. "The greatest warrior," her grandmother had written in her precise handwriting, "is not the one who wins every battle, but the one who understands which battles need to be fought and which can be won without fighting at all." It was a lesson that Maya had learned not just intellectually but experientially through the difficult and sometimes painful process of navigating complex social dynamics and moral choices during her time at Riverside High. It was a lesson she would carry with her into whatever came next, a foundation upon which she would continue building her understanding of how to move through the world with both strength and wisdom, courage and compassion, power and responsibility. And in that moment, standing at the threshold between the familiar past and the uncertain future, Maya Chen felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, confident in the knowledge that her grandmother's teachings had prepared her not just to survive, but to thrive, not just to protect herself, but to contribute to creating a world where such protection was less necessary, where communities were built on foundations of mutual respect and justice rather than fear and domination. It was an ambitious vision, perhaps even an idealistic one, but Maya had seen enough during her time at Riverside High to believe that such change was possible, that the world her grandmother had dreamed of could be built one choice, one community, one transformed culture at a time.